Before the galaxy was drowned in fire, before worlds became nothing more than numbers in casualty reports, there was stillness, the kind of stillness that feels eternal, but is already beginning to crack. And from that stillness, the Clone Wars were born. A conflict that was less a war between systems and more a war between destinies. A storm of stars in which every life, every choice, every thread of loyalty was pulled into the current. It began as all storms do, with whispers, with shadows, with men in robes speaking in chambers and believing they still held control. But soon the whispers became commands, the shadows became armies, and the chambers became empty echoes against the thunder of blasters and the hiss of lightsabers. The Clone Wars stretched from the glittering heart of Coruscant to the frozen edges of Orto, Plutonia, from the desert spires of Geonosis to the watery depths of Mon Cala, each world becoming a stage for battles that burned bright and then vanished, leaving only silence in their wake. For the Jedi, who had spent centuries as keepers of peace, the war became a mirror that showed them not as sages, but as soldiers. Their sabers once raised for defense, now cutting paths through droid battalions, their teachings bent beneath the weight of command. Their compassion eroded by strategy, and yet still they fought, because to not fight was to abandon the republic they had sworn to protect. For the clones, bred in secret on Kamino, the war was both birth and destiny, their first breath drawn in armor, their first thought trained toward loyalty, their first step into a galaxy already at war, and yet within them flickered individuality, sparks of humanity that shone through the identical faces, Rex, Cody, Fives, Echo. Brothers bound not by blood, but by design, learning to live even as they marched toward death. And above them all, hidden in plain sight, a hand pulled the strings, for the Clone Wars were never truly war, but theater. Orchestrated by Darth Sidious to weaken both sides, to turn Jedi into generals and soldiers into traitors without choice, until the Republic collapsed into empire, and freedom itself was renamed Order. To speak of the Clone Wars, then, is to speak of a tragedy written as myth, of a galaxy that believed it was fighting for survival when it was already being consumed from within. And yet it is also to speak of courage, of friendships formed in fire, of sacrifices that glowed like stars against the darkness, of moments when hope endured even as shadow grew. This story is not told to rouse you into battle, but to ease you into reflection, to let the rhythm of its rise and fall carry you gently into calm. For the Clone Wars were not only explosions and betrayals, but also the spaces between, the silences after battle, the breaths of soldiers who looked to the horizon and dreamed of peace. As you listen, let the weight of those years drift through you like a current. Let the storm pass overhead without shaking you. And know that though the Clone Wars scarred the galaxy forever, they too became memory, and memory is softer than war, quieter than blaster fire, steadier than fear. It lingers not to wound, but to remind, to hum like a lullaby across time, carrying you now into rest beneath the vast, unending sky of stars. Every great fire begins with a spark too small to notice, and the Clone Wars, though remembered for its thunder of fleets and clash of armies, began with whispers, with trade disputes and blockades, with shadows that moved in places where light had grown complacent. And nowhere was this more clear than in the days of the Naboo crisis, when the Trade Federation, urged by a master unseen, set warships around a peaceful world and believed themselves untouchable behind the shield of legality. Into this simmering conflict stepped two Jedi, Qui-Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan Kenobi, emissaries of peace who found instead the first embers of a storm. For the blockade was no simple act of economics, but the first thread in a tapestry woven by a Sith Lord who had been hiding in plain sight. Darth Sidious whispered to viceroys and senators alike, moving them like pieces on a board, and as Naboo's skies filled with shadows, the Jedi found themselves in the midst of a game older than they understood, one in which every choice seemed ordinary, but each consequence was monumental. Qui-Gon, ever the maverick, trusted the living force, sensing that destiny itself had brought them to this world at this time, while Obi-Wan, younger but steadier, obeyed with precision, and together they uncovered not only the suffering of a people, but the presence of an enemy thought extinct, the Sith, whose red blades burned like forgotten nightmares brought back into daylight. On the polished floors of Theed's palace, on the plains where Gungan warriors rose in defense of their home, and in the hangars where pilots braved impossible odds, the galaxy shifted, for the Sith revealed themselves in flesh when Darth Maul ignited his double-bladed saber, moving like fury incarnate, a phantom risen from legend to strike at the guardians of peace. The duel that followed was not simply a clash of blades, but a prophecy made visible. Qui-Gon struck down, Obi-Wan rising in fury, Maul cleaved yet not destroyed, and above it all, a boy from Tatooine watching the world bend around him. Anakin Skywalker, discovered by chance or by fate, carried within him a strength in the Force greater than any the Council had known, his presence both promise and warning. And with Qui-Gon's dying breath, the plea was made to train him, to see in the boy not danger, but destiny. The Council hesitated, their vision clouded, their wisdom strained, and though they accepted Obi-Wan's determination, doubt lingered like mist at dawn, a doubt that would fracture into shadow as years passed. For in this one sequence of days, Naboo besieged, a queen defiant, a master fallen, an apprentice tested, and a boy chosen. The stage was set, the phantom menace revealed not only in the Sith warrior's blade, but in the patient hand of Sidious, whose true identity remained cloaked beneath senatorial robes, smiling as the galaxy applauded him. The Republic celebrated victory, believing itself safe, but beneath their cheers the current of war had already begun, slow and silent, flowing toward a sea they could not yet imagine. This was the beginning, the stirring of shadows, the breath before the storm, and though few saw it, the Clone Wars had already whispered their arrival. But history is not shaped only by battles fought. It is shaped also by the seeds planted in silence. And in the aftermath of Naboo, those seeds were sown deep, watered not by light, but by deception. For even as the Jedi returned to Coruscant with grief at Qui-Gon's passing and questions about the child he had believed to be the chosen one, Chancellor Palpatine stood before the Senate with a smile that masked the triumph of Darth Sidious, his other face, who had orchestrated every thread of crisis to place himself at the galaxy's center. The Trade Federation was humbled, yes, but never destroyed. Maul was defeated, but not gone. The Senate restored confidence in the Republic, but at the cost of granting more power to a politician who had long desired it. And so the Phantom Menace did not fade with the Battle of Naboo. It deepened, spreading like roots beneath soil, waiting for the right season to rise. For the Jedi, the revelation of the Sith's survival was like a wound reopened. Their texts had spoken of dark lords who had vanished 1,000 years before, their extinction believed so complete that few living Jedi had ever expected to see their kind again. And yet here stood proof, scarlet and merciless. The council debated in long, heavy sessions, wondering whether the apprentice on Naboo had been master or servant, and if servant, then where his master hid. And though Yoda spoke of the dark side clouding their vision, though Mace Windu urged vigilance, no clear answer came, and the Order settled uneasily into denial, hoping that perhaps the shadow was smaller than it felt. But shadows are never small when they belong to Sith, and as years slipped by, the Senate became more entangled in Palpatine's careful hand, while the Jedi became more entangled in their own doubts. Obi-Wan, now a knight, took Anakin as his Padawan in honor of Qui-Gon's last wish, but his heart was heavy with caution, for he had seen in the boy both brilliance and recklessness, kindness and fury, and though he vowed to train him, the task was less a gift than a test of his own endurance. Anakin himself struggled with a destiny too large for his shoulders, praised for victories in the pod race, yet haunted by the slavery of his childhood. Gifted in the Force, yet aching with attachment, he was both light and shadow even in his youth, and the Jedi who watched him felt unease, but did not know how to shape it into guidance. And so Naboo faded from the headlines. Its people rebuilt their cities, its queen rose in prominence, and yet the galaxy did not heal. For beneath every speech in the Senate, beneath every lesson in the temple, beneath every mission across the stars, the phantom menace whispered still, patient, certain that time itself was his ally. To look back is to see it clearly, that Naboo was not an end but a beginning, that the war had already been set in motion, that the Clone Wars did not erupt from nowhere, but grew from this soil where Sith plotted in shadow, Jedi wrestled with prophecy, and a boy from a desert world began walking a path that would one day divide the galaxy in two. And as the years carried forward, the phantom menace stirred again and again, until its whisper became roar, until its shadow became night, until the galaxy awoke too late to stop what had already been begun. The sparks that would ignite the Clone Wars did not burst suddenly from the void, but smoldered in the dust of a world called Geonosis, its canyons carved by hive cities, its skies filled with the hum of industry, its people builders of machines that would one day march across the galaxy. And it was here that Count Dooku, once Jedi Master and now Dark Lord's apprentice, gathered the threads of rebellion into a confederacy of independent systems, promising freedom from corruption even as he chained them to shadow. The Republic, long hollowed by bureaucracy, found itself paralyzed as world after world threatened secession, and into that paralysis walked Jedi, not yet soldiers, but still emissaries, seeking to hold together a galaxy already fracturing. When Obi-Wan Kenobi traced whispers of a droid army to Geonosis, he uncovered not simply weapons, but a vast conspiracy, a war already prepared in secret. And as he was captured and held in the arena of the hives, the spark brightened. Anakin Skywalker and Padme Amidala rushed to rescue him, their courage tangled with love that dared to grow despite Jedi codes and senatorial duty. And they too were bound in chains beneath the scorching suns, awaiting execution as beasts thundered into the sand. Yet the Jedi did not abandon their own, for when the first blows were about to fall, the arena filled with lightsabers, dozens of Jedi descending as one, green and blue blades igniting like stars against the dust, and Geonosians shrieked as droids poured forth to meet them. It was chaos. Sabers whirled, blasters fired, Jedi fell one by one as metal overwhelmed flesh. And for the first time in centuries, the Guardians of Peace fought not as negotiators, but as warriors, blood mixing with sand, as the Order realized too late that it had stepped into a trap. Then the air roared with the sound of transports, and white-armored soldiers descended, an army bred in secret now revealed as the Grand Army of the Republic, clones engineered for obedience, arriving with precision to sweep the field. Yoda himself led them, his small form commanding vast power, and as gunships thundered across the sky and walkers lumbered into the arena, the spark became flame, for the Jedi and clones together pushed back the tide, overwhelming droids in a storm of fire and light. Yet, even in victory, the cost was clear. Jedi dead upon the sand, trust burned in the revelation that an army had been waiting, prepared without the Council's knowledge, placed conveniently at their disposal, as if destiny had been arranged. The first battle of Geonosis ended with Dooku's escape into the shadows, Anakin's arm severed by his former kin-turned-enemy, Obi-Wan wounded but alive, and Yoda forced to face his old student in a duel that shook stone and air, master against apprentice, wisdom against betrayal, neither destroyed, both retreating into the war they had unleashed. The Republic celebrated survival. But in truth, the war had begun. Its sparks scattering across 1,000 systems, its embers already searing worlds that had not yet heard its name. And from that day forward, the galaxy was no longer at peace, but at war. A war whose fire would consume it utterly. Yet the true weight of Geonosis was not measured in the sand that drank Jedi blood, nor in the smoke that hung over shattered hives, but in the unseen chains that fastened themselves around the galaxy the moment the battle ended. For though the Republic called it victory, it was in truth the beginning of endless war. The Senate, stirred by fear and inflamed by Palpatine's voice, gave thunderous approval to the deployment of the new Grand Army. Clones whose existence had been revealed at the exact moment they were most needed. And though the Jedi Council questioned the strange convenience of it, though Yoda's eyes grew heavy with suspicion, necessity bound their hands, and the Order took command of an army they had not created. From that day, the Jedi ceased to be keepers of peace and became generals, a shift subtle in name but seismic in meaning, for their robes now brushed the mud of battlefields, their sabers cut through battalions instead of negotiations, and their wisdom was drowned by the language of strategy. On Geonosis itself, the factories had only just begun their churn, and Dooku's escape meant the Confederacy would not vanish but strengthen, gathering systems emboldened by his promise of independence. And in their desperation, the Jedi pursued him, Obi-Wan with weariness, Anakin with fury, Yoda with sorrow, yet none could prevent his retreat into the dark. The clones, fresh from Kamino, marched in perfect lines, their helmets glinting in the sun, and though they fought with precision and loyalty, some Jedi could not help but sense unease. An army bred for war, made without choice, handed to the Republic as if by providence, and already bound to them like shadows. Padme returned to Naboo shaken but resolute, carrying within her the spark of a secret bond with Anakin. One that grew stronger in the crucible of Geonosis, and though they spoke little of it, its presence colored every glance, every silence, every decision. The galaxy itself seemed to change its rhythm after that battle. Trade routes bristled with fleets, star systems declared allegiance to one banner or another, factories glowed with relentless industry, and children grew up learning to fear the symbols of the separatists or the clones, depending on which skies their worlds lay under. What had been a single spark in one arena now became a spreading wildfire, and the Jedi, whether they admitted it or not, had struck the flint themselves by raising sabers in that dust. For the first time in centuries, peace was no longer the Republic's foundation, but its dream, and from Geonosis forward, the dream slipped further away with every dawn. The war, once sparked on Geonosis, did not remain contained within the dust of its hives, but spread like fire carried on the wind, leaping from world to world until the entire galaxy burned, and the stars themselves became battlefields. Fleets clashed above glittering city planets, walkers thundered across endless plains, droids spilled from factories like rivers of metal, and clones marched with unflinching precision, each campaign a new stanza in a song that seemed to have no end. Christophsis, with its crystal spires and neon skies, became the stage for early victories that announced the Republic's resolve, Obi-Wan Kenobi's measured leadership, and Anakin Skywalker's daring maneuvers proving to the galaxy that the Jedi could indeed wield command, though every triumph carried the cost of lives spent like currency. Ryloth groaned under occupation, its people starving beneath separatist blockades, until clone squadrons and Jedi broke the chains. But even in victory, the Twi'leks remembered the suffering, the war never truly lifting but shifting its shape. On Kamino, the storm-lashed seas guarded the vats of life where new clones were born, and separatist assaults sought to crush the Republic at its root, forcing Jedi to defend the very factories of soldiers they did not choose to create, their blades flashing against waves of aquatic droids as lightning cracked the skies. Each battle was different, each world unique, yet all bore the same weight. Civilians fleeing into exile, children learning to hide when shadows crossed the sky. Cities once vibrant, reduced to rubble that glowed under distant suns. For the Jedi, it was a war not only of armies but of identity. Their code stretched thin as they sat in gunships giving orders, as they raised sabers against not one foe but thousands. As they struggled to reconcile guardianship with conquest. For the clones, the war was existence itself. They lived in days counted by campaigns, their brothers falling beside them, their names whispered in honor or forgotten in silence, each skirmish carving stories of valor into lives that had never been given a choice. And still the separatists surged, their droid factories endless, their leaders cunning, their war effort bolstered by fear and greed. Yet behind their banners always lurked the hand of Sidious, the master who prolonged conflict not to win but to drain, to grind, to turn Jedi into weary blades, and the Republic into a brittle shell. Across the stars, the war became rhythm, planets lit by fire, fleets shattered, survivors counted, and then the next battle rising like a wave, until the galaxy itself seemed to breathe war with every rotation. And though heroes shone within it, Anakin bold and reckless, Obi-Wan steady and wise, Ahsoka young and unyielding, Rex loyal and human, the scale of the storm was so vast that even their courage felt like candles flickering against the night. Yet those candles mattered, for they illuminated what the war sought to erase. That in the endless tide of blasters and droids, there were still faces, still choices, still sparks of humanity that refused to be drowned. This was war across the stars, not a single story but countless, woven together into a tapestry that stretched across the galaxy, a tapestry whose threads glowed with courage and bled with sorrow, whose pattern none could yet see, but whose design had already been drawn in the hidden chambers of a Sith Lord smiling as the galaxy burned. But to truly understand the war across the stars, one must drift from battle to battle, letting each world tell its own fragment of the story. For the Clone Wars were not one war but 1,000, each unfolding under different suns, each leaving behind scars unique and permanent. On Felucia, where colossal fungi rose like towers and jungles glowed with alien light, Jedi and clones struggled against wave after wave of droids, their armor swallowed by spores, their movements slowed by terrain that seemed alive. The war grinding on in silence, broken only by the whine of blasters. On Cala, beneath oceans ruled by kings and contested by species locked in ancient rivalries, the Republic and Separatists turned the sea itself into battlefield. Gunships diving beneath waves, lightsabers cutting through currents as clones adapted to breathing masks and fought side by side with Mon Calamari soldiers. Their struggle proving that even the deepest waters were not spared the storm. On Umbara, the shadow world where the sun could not pierce the mist, the war turned inward, for the enemy was not only the Separatists, but the dark choices of a Jedi general named Pong Krell, whose cruelty and disregard for clones revealed the fracture growing between the Order and the army it commanded. Under his hand, brothers were treated as expendable pawns, and the battle for Umbara became not only a fight for territory, but for dignity, as troopers like Rex, Fives, and Dogma found the courage to stand against tyranny, even when it wore Jedi robes. On the icy surface of Orto, Plutonia, Jedi discovered that not every world wished to be saved. For the native Talts resisted both Republic and Separatist, showing that the war's binaries ignored the truths of smaller peoples caught between giants. And always, the rhythm repeated. Siege of Christophsis, liberation of Ryloth, defense of Kamino, skirmishes above Alderaan and Corellia, each one another star in the constellation of conflict. For the galaxy, war became normalcy. Fleets, a constant presence in the skies, clone patrols marching through cities, Separatist droids trampling fields where once farmers had sown crops, and children learned the shape of starships as clearly as letters. Even victories blurred into weariness, for each triumph only led to another call for reinforcements, another desperate plea from a governor, another assignment for Jedi who no longer had time to meditate, who no longer had the stillness to remember the peace they once guarded. And yet within that endlessness were also moments of connection, a clone soldier sharing a story of his brothers lost, a Jedi comforting villagers whose homes would be rebuilt, a laugh carried on the wind before the next strike. Small mercies that proved the war had not erased all humanity. The war across the stars was both vast and intimate, both myth and scar. And though the galaxy could not yet see it, every battle, every campaign, every sacrifice was leading not toward peace, but toward a single command, waiting to be spoken. A single night when the stars themselves would seem to betray the Jedi, and the galaxy would awaken not to war, but to empire. Amid the thunder of fleets and the endless tide of battles, the Clone Wars were not remembered only for worlds lost and won, but for the people who carried its weight. For within the storm there were always faces, some known across the galaxy, others known only by their brothers. And it was these heroes and bonds of brotherhood that gave the war its soul. At the heart of it stood Anakin Skywalker, a Jedi Knight unlike any other, reckless and brilliant, whose victories were as dazzling as comets and whose flaws burned just as fiercely. He fought with a passion that the council mistrusted, yet his soldiers adored him, for he never left them behind, never sent them into dangers he would not face himself, and in that loyalty he became not only their general, but their brother. By his side was Obi-Wan Kenobi, patient and steady, the negotiator-turned-general who led not with fury, but with calm, his blue blade and quiet voice guiding his men through sieges and blockades. His presence a reminder that honor could survive even in war. Together, master and apprentice, now equals, became the Republic's brightest hope, their names spoken as legends in camps across 1,000 battlefronts. Yet even their brilliance could not shine without the soldiers who marched beside them. For the clones, bred on Kamino in identical armor, revealed themselves not as numbers, but as individuals, each forging identity from the smallest of details. The tally marks carved into helmets, the nicknames passed in barracks, the laughter shared before a drop, the grief carried after a brother's death. Captain Rex, loyal to Anakin, yet unafraid to question him when lives were at stake, became a leader not through design but through trust, his men following him because they believed in him. Commander Cody, steadfast at Obi-Wan's side, embodied discipline so precise it became almost comfort, his presence a steady hand amid chaos. Others, like Fives and Echo, like Hardcase and Jesse, carried their humanity forward in defiance of the very system that sought to erase it, their voices proving that even lives engineered for obedience could burn with individuality. And then there was Ahsoka Tano, the Padawan assigned to Anakin, a girl thrust into war when she should have been in the temple, yet who grew swiftly into wisdom, her courage balancing her master's recklessness, her compassion offering light where his fire threatened to consume. The bond between Anakin, Obi-Wan, and Ahsoka became the human heart of the war, a triad of loyalty that carried not just soldiers, but entire worlds through darkness. Yet even beyond them, in every platoon and every legion, the same truth emerged. That war was not faceless, that heroes were not only Jedi but also clones who stood shoulder to shoulder, who gave their lives without hesitation, who carried names like echoes of individuality in defiance of being called expendable. And so the Clone Wars, though vast and terrible, were remembered not only in maps and strategies, but in friendships and brotherhoods, in the trust built between a knight and his captain, in the bond between brothers who shared the same face but different hearts, in the laughter that rose even in trenches, in the loyalty that endured even as betrayal waited unseen. These were the heroes and brothers who gave the war its humanity, and though history often forgets them, the Force remembers, carrying their names like quiet stars scattered across the night. Yet the war's truest measure of brotherhood was not in the Jedi alone, but in the clones themselves, who, though born from the same template, learned to carve identities out of repetition, each finding meaning in gestures that set them apart. Paint on armor, haircuts sharp or wild, tattoos etched as rebellion against anonymity. To outsiders they seemed the same, but to one another they were irreplaceable. Rex steady as bedrock, Fives bold and questioning, Echo thoughtful and precise, Cody disciplined to the last breath, Wolf scarred yet unbroken, each carrying within him a spirit that no Kaminoan design could erase. Around Around campfires made from the wreckage of battlefields, they told stories of their brothers, recited names of those who had fallen, as if recitation itself could hold them close. And in that ritual they proved that the Force does not choose who matters. Life itself declares it. The Jedi, who once had doubted what these soldiers were, grew to respect them, to call them comrades, to fight beside them not as tools, but as men. And though some, like Pong Krell, betrayed that bond with cruelty, most Jedi came to see in their troops not an army, but a family. For Anakin, this bond became unshakable, his soldiers loving him not because he was flawless, but because he was reckless in ways that saved them. A general who dove into fire rather than sending them alone. A leader whose defiance of the Council often translated into mercy for his men. For Obi-Wan, the bond was quieter, a mutual respect with Cody that carried them through sieges and retreats alike, a trust so deep that words were often unnecessary. For Ahsoka, who was closer in age to many clones than to her fellow Jedi, the bond was playful and genuine. Her friendships with Rex and others forged not from rank, but from shared trials, laughter woven between firefights. These bonds mattered, for they gave the war texture beyond the dust of strategy, showing that even within a galaxy manipulated by Sith, even within a war designed to drain hope, there was still humanity, still love, still loyalty so fierce it could light the darkest nights. And yet, unseen to them all, that very loyalty would one day be twisted into the cruelest betrayal. A command hidden in their blood, waiting to turn brothers against brothers, masters against soldiers, friends into executioners. But in these years, before that night, their bond was pure, their trust unshaken, and it was this brotherhood that gave the Clone Wars its heart. Men who should never have been born learning to live, Jedi who should never have been generals learning to lead, friendships forged not in peace but in fire, glowing all the brighter because every one of them knew, consciously or not, that their time together was destined to be brief. Brotherhood in the Clone Wars was not always measured in victories, but often in losses, for every bond carried the shadow of grief, and the soldiers and Jedi who fought together learned to hold both joy and sorrow as companions. When a trooper fell, his name was spoken by his brothers, carved into armor, or carried as a story told to the next generation of cadets on Kamino. And in that way, the fallen lived on, not erased by the endless march of war, but woven into its memory. Rex carried the weight of every man who died under his command, even as he joked and fought with the same steady resilience. And though his face never aged differently from those around him, his eyes grew older with each campaign. Anakin bore the deaths of his men with fury, lashing out at enemies with a ferocity that frightened even his allies. And in that ferocity his men saw not cruelty, but devotion. The desperate need of a leader who refused to let their sacrifices be in vain. Obi-Wan carried his losses more quietly, his grief folded into calm words and weary silences. And though Cody seldom spoke of death, his discipline itself was a kind of tribute, an unbroken promise that their brothers would not be forgotten. Ahsoka, still young in years, grew old in spirit as she learned the names of troopers who laughed with her one day and were gone the next, her compassion deepening with every funeral, her resolve hardening with every farewell. This cycle of life and death became the rhythm of the Clone Wars, a rhythm that bound Jedi and clones not only in battle, but in mourning, forging a kinship that could not be fabricated in laboratories or councils. And within this kinship lay the truest heroism of the war, not in grand victories or famous generals, but in the quiet endurance of soldiers who fought beside one another, knowing that the next mission might be their last, yet still finding room to smile, to share rations, to carve marks into helmet, to build something human out of something manufactured. They were not brothers because they shared the same face. They were brothers because they chose to see each other as more than shadows of one man, because they chose to believe in one another when the galaxy treated them as disposable, because they carried love in the very heart of war. And the Jedi, flawed and strained as they were, became part of that family, their own identities reshaped by the trust of men they never asked for, but came to treasure. Heroes and brothers, that is what they were, and that is how they will always be remembered. Not as numbers in records or pawns in a Sith's design, but as souls who stood together against a galaxy unraveling, who held each other in life and in memory, who proved that even in a war built on deception, truth could still be found in loyalty, in friendship, in the bond that no betrayal could erase from the Force itself. If the Jedi and the clones gave the war its heart, then Count Dooku and his disciples gave it its shadow. For behind every clash of armies, behind every hollow Senate decree, the war was sustained not by politics alone, but by the will of the Sith. And Dooku, once Jedi Master, now Darth Tyrannus, stood at the center of that web. He was not like the Sith of old, brutish and consumed only by rage, but elegant, articulate, a man whose voice could soothe as easily as it could command. And in that poise lay his danger, for he dressed tyranny in the language of justice, persuading worlds that leaving the Republic was freedom, that serving the Separatists was sovereignty, when in truth every promise was only a leash tied to Sidious. To the galaxy, Dooku was the face of rebellion, but to those who saw deeper, he was a mask himself, a servant cloaked in dignity, while bound to a master he would never surpass. His apprentice, Asajj Ventress, was forged in cruelty, a child of war whose life had been torn apart until she was molded into a weapon of hatred, her twin red blade spinning with grace that mirrored her master's elegance, but carried a raw, wounded fury beneath. Where Dooku charmed, she struck. Where Dooku negotiated, she assassinated. Together they embodied the two faces of the Sith's war, seduction and violence, and together they spread chaos across the stars. Yet even in their bond there was treachery, for Dooku trained her not to raise her, but to use her, and Sidious, always watchful, whispered of her potential as a threat, demanding that Dooku prove his loyalty by discarding her when she grew too strong. And so the web tightened, threads of betrayal woven into threads of allegiance, until no one could tell which vow would hold and which would break. In this web spun countless schemes. Mercenaries like Cad Bane hired to kidnap senators and steal holocrons. Warlords like Grievous unleashed to ravage planets with mechanical precision. Networks of spies infiltrating both Republic and Separatists alike, all feeding into Sidious' singular goal. Not victory, but exhaustion. Not conquest, but collapse, ensuring that when the war ended, the galaxy would have no strength left to resist the Empire. Dooku believed himself master of this game, yet he was only ever a piece, and Ventress believed herself apprentice, yet she too was expendable. And in that layered betrayal lay the true genius of Sidious, who ensured that even his servants could never trust one another. The web of the Sith was not lines drawn on star maps, but threads woven into souls, tugging at ambition, fear, and desire until whole armies danced to its pull. And the Clone Wars, seen through their eyes, were not tragedy, but design. Every death another step toward the silence that awaited when the Republic crumbled. And so, while Jedi and clones fought openly in fields of dust and light, grew too strong. And so the web tightened, threads of betrayal woven into threads of allegiance, until no one could tell which vow would hold and which would break. In this web spun countless schemes. Mercenaries like Cad Bane hired to kidnap senators and steal holocrons. Warlords like Grievous unleashed to ravage planets with mechanical precision. Networks of spies infiltrating both Republic and Separatists alike, all feeding into Sidious' singular goal. Not victory, but exhaustion. Not conquest, but collapse. Ensuring that when the war ended, the galaxy would have no strength left to resist the Empire. And to disillusioned Jedi, he spoke of corruption festering at the Republic's heart. His words carried weight because they were not entirely false. The Republic was bloated, the Senate fractious, the Jedi increasingly entangled in politics, and in those half-truths, Dooku found his leverage. But beneath every promise lay the same reality, that all roads led to Sidious. Ventress, fierce and loyal in her own way, became the sharpest of his blades, leading missions against Jedi who would never have suspected betrayal from one trained in their arts. Time and again she crossed sabers with Obi-Wan, with Anakin, with Ahsoka, and in each duel her rage was matched by skill, her hatred honed into precision. She fought as if every strike was vengeance for her own stolen childhood, yet within her burned the same hunger all Sith apprentices carried, the hunger to be more than a tool. Sidious saw it, of course, and where Dooku valued her as a weapon, Sidious saw her as a threat, demanding she be cast aside, a reminder that within the web of the Sith, even loyalty was temporary. Betrayal became a crucible, and in her survival beyond abandonment, she revealed a truth the Sith themselves often forgot, that those who are discarded sometimes burn brightest. Dooku's own duplicity mirrored that of his master, for though he bowed to Sidious, in his heart he dreamed of replacing him, of training Ventress or Savage Opress, or even Anakin Skywalker to stand with him against the greater darkness. But ambition in the Sith is not a plan. It is a leash, and Sidious tugged it whenever he pleased, ensuring Dooku's rebellion never rose beyond fantasy. Thus, the web grew taut. Separatist leaders bickered yet obeyed. Droid armies marched yet could never win. Jedi resisted yet never triumphed. And all the while the war spiraled not toward resolution, but toward exhaustion. Ventress's fall and survival, Dooku's dignity twisted into servitude, the endless parade of pawns raised and sacrificed. All of it revealed that the Clone Wars were not a contest between Republic and Separatists at all, but a single design in which both sides were meant to lose. And so the web of the Sith remained invisible to most, a net stretched across the galaxy's stars, threads glinting faintly in the Force, unseen by those trapped in it, waiting for the moment when Sidious would finally pull it closed, and everything, Jedi, clones, Separatists, Republic, would be caught together in silence. The war, having burned through the core and mid-rim, soon spilled outward into the vast and untamed reaches of the outer rim. And there, it became something harsher, something that stripped away even the pretense of honor. For the battles waged in those distant sectors were not staged beneath the polished domes of Coruscant, or broadcast in the Senate's chambers, but fought in mud and jungle, in frozen wastelands and scorched deserts, on worlds where no diplomat had ever walked, and where no promise of reconstruction would ever come. The sieges of the Outer Rim became the war's longest echoes. Megiddo, where icy cities glittered with wealth stolen by the banking clan. Clones and Jedi trudging through glassy streets, shattered by cannon fire, their breath freezing even as blaster bolts burned. Felucia, a world of vibrant fungi and choking spores, where Jedi like Ayla Secura led exhausted battalions through terrain that seemed alive, its beauty masking its cruelty. Saleucami, shattered by cannon fire, their breath freezing even as blaster bolts burned. Felucia, a world of vibrant fungi and choking spores, where Jedi like Ayla Secura led exhausted battalions through terrain that seemed alive, its beauty masking its cruelty. Saleucami, shattered by cannon fire, their breath freezing even as blaster bolts burned. Felucia, a world of vibrant fungi and choking spores, where Jedi like Ayla Secura led exhausted battalions through terrain that seemed alive, its beauty masking its cruelty. Saleucami, shattered by cannon fire, their breath freezing even as blaster bolts burned. Felucia, a world of vibrant fungi and choking spores, where Jedi like Ayla Secura led exhausted battalions through terrain that seemed alive, its beauty masking its cruelty. Saleucami, shattered by cannon fire, their breath freezing even as blaster bolts burned. Felucia, a world of vibrant fungi and choking spores, where Jedi like Ayla Secura led exhausted battalions through terrain that seemed alive, its beauty masking its cruelty. Saleucami, scarred by droid foundries and buried fortresses, where soldiers dug in for months beneath an alien sky, each sunrise bringing the same stalemate of fire and attrition. The Outer Rim campaigns stretched men and women to their breaking points, Jedi and clone alike, for distance itself was another enemy. Supplies faltered, reinforcements came late, communications failed, and more than once units were stranded, fighting long after the Republic had forgotten them. And yet, in that remoteness, bonds deepened because survival demanded trust. Jedi who once held themselves apart from their troops now shared trenches, ate the same rations, carried the same grief. Scarred by droid foundries and buried fortresses, where soldiers dug in for months beneath an alien sky, each sunrise bringing the same stalemate of fire and attrition. The Outer Rim campaigns stretched men and women to their breaking points, Jedi and clone alike, for distance itself was another enemy. Supplies faltered, reinforcements came late, communications failed, and more than once units were stranded, fighting long after the Republic had forgotten them. And yet, in that remoteness, bonds deepened because survival demanded trust. Jedi who once held themselves apart from their troops now shared trenches, ate the same rations, carried the same grief. For distance itself was another enemy. Supplies faltered, reinforcements came late, communications failed, and more than once units were stranded, fighting long after the Republic had forgotten them. And yet, in that remoteness, bonds deepened because survival demanded trust. Jedi who once held themselves apart from their troops now shared trenches, ate the same rations, carried the same grief. And the clones, who had once looked upon their generals as distant, began to see them as family forged in fire. Still, the war here was merciless. Grievous prowled the stars, his fleet striking like a storm, worlds conquered before warnings could be sent. Dooku's agents turned local populations into unwilling pawns, sowing rebellions and uprisings in places the Republic could not afford to protect. And the Jedi, spread thinner with each campaign, began to fray, their calm worn down by the endless grind. For the people of the Outer Rim, there was no difference between Republic and Separatist, only occupation, only armies that devoured their harvests and left graves behind. And to them the war was. And the clones, who had once looked upon their generals as distant, began to see them as family forged in fire. Still, the war here was merciless. Grievous prowled the stars, his fleet striking like a storm, worlds conquered before warnings could be sent. Dooku's agents turned local populations into unwilling pawns, sowing rebellions and uprisings in places the Republic could not afford to protect. And the Jedi, spread thinner with each campaign, began to fray, their calm worn down by the endless grind. For the people of the Outer Rim, there was no difference between Republic and Separatist, only occupation, only armies that devoured their harvests and left graves behind. And to them the war was in alien jungles, with compassion still in her eyes despite endless war. Plo Koon, beloved by his troops, flying into storms to shield them with his calm. Each Jedi carried their men as far as they could, and each clone carried their Jedi as long as they were allowed. And though the Outer Rim consumed them in fire and silence, their bond became the last spark of humanity in a war designed to erase it. When historians would later speak of these sieges, they would list planets and numbers, dates and casualties. But the truth of the Outer Rim lived not in maps, but in memories, in the way soldiers leaned on each other beneath foreign suns, in the way Jedi stood taller even when weary, in the way children on forgotten worlds remembered a kind face in armor long after fleets had departed. And so the war in the Outer Rim dragged to its grim conclusion, not as a single decisive victory, but as a long, slow collapse. Its toll measured not in battles won, but in hope lost, until the galaxy itself seemed to sigh in surrender, ready for the night that was already rising. The war could not be told without the story of the clones themselves, for they were both its engine and its greatest tragedy, soldiers born not of love or choice, but of design, brought into being on Kamino, where rain never ceased and seas swallowed every horizon. Their lives accelerated so that childhood lasted only moments before armor was strapped to their bodies and numbers were painted across their chests. To the galaxy they were seen as interchangeable, the same face repeated 10,000 times, yet within the sameness flickered individuality too stubborn to be erased. Men who cut their hair in jagged lines, who painted helmets with jagged fangs or bright colors, who named themselves Rex, Cody, Fives, Echo, Jesse, Hardcase, Dogma, Waxer, Boyle, and countless more, each carving identity from the blank slate they had been given. Their struggle was not only with the droids they fought, but with the truth of their existence, with the knowledge that they had been bred to serve a war they had never chosen, with the quiet yearning to live beyond the battlefield, even as their very bodies were built for nothing else. Some clones dreamed of farms on distant worlds, of children they might never have, of sons they wished to see without marching orders dictating the view, And though most buried those dreams beneath discipline, a few dared to desert, to carve lives beyond the chain code, proving that even a man designed in a lab could long for freedom. Their camaraderie was their lifeline, for in one another they found proof of humanity. They mourned their dead not as statistics but as brothers. They painted tally marks on their armor not to boast but to remember. They laughed together in rare moments between battles, clinging to joy because they knew how fragile it was. The Jedi, at first uncertain how to treat an army that had appeared overnight, came to see in them more than soldiers, for men like Anakin, Obi-Wan, and Plo Koon treated their clones as equals, while others, like Krell, revealed the cruelty of those who saw them as tools. The war revealed both truths, that clones could rise to be leaders, heroes in their own right, and that their struggle for recognition was constant, fought not only against enemies on the field, but against the galaxy's blindness. They bled in every battle. They sacrificed without hesitation, and still in their quiet moments, they wondered who they were beyond the helmet, whether the galaxy would remember them as men or as shadows. Yet perhaps the deepest struggle was one they never saw, a secret buried in their very blood. The inhibitor chips placed within their skulls, waiting for a single command to twist their loyalty, to transform brotherhood into execution, to turn their love for their Jedi generals into the weapon that would destroy them. They could not sense it, could not fight it, and yet the shadow of that truth haunted the Force itself, a silent cruelty humming beneath every battle, every bond, every oath of loyalty. The clones' struggle was the struggle to be men in a war that insisted they were property, to be brothers in a galaxy that saw them as numbers, to be human in a design that had stripped them of choice. And though history would one day call them soldiers of the Republic, their truest title was simpler. They were brothers, born in storm, living in war, dreaming of peace that most would never see. Yet what made the clones' struggle most profound was not only that they fought an enemy built to destroy them, but that they also fought the silence of a galaxy that did not care to see them as more than shadows. For to most senators, their names were irrelevant, their victories expected, their deaths unnoticed. And in that erasure, the clones found themselves clinging harder to one another, building a culture in barracks and battlefields that was invisible to the worlds they saved. They painted murals on transport walls, wrote songs and chants, carried helmets of fallen brothers until they cracked beyond repair, rituals that stitched humanity into lives that others called expendable. In some, individuality blazed so brightly it defied the very concept of uniformity. Fives questioning authority, even when truth endangered him. Echo refusing to let duty crush his curiosity. Rex balancing loyalty with conscience. Cody embodying discipline so unshakable that even his doubts were buried beneath duty. Some found compassion in small moments. Waxer and Boyle befriending a lone child on Ryloth, carrying her memory as proof that they were more than weapons. And in such moments, the struggle became not just survival, but dignity, the assertion that their lives mattered beyond the mission. Yet there were also shadows within their ranks, for not every brother bore the burden with grace. Some buckled under pressure, others lashed out in violence, and a few betrayed their kin. Proof that even within engineered obedience, the complexity of humanity remained. The Jedi, too, struggled with their role in shaping the clones' fate, some treating them as partners and friends, others holding to the belief that they were mere creations of war. a divide that wounded the very bond the war had forced between them. And always, beneath it all, the hidden truth pulsed like a heartbeat waiting to stop. The inhibitor chips buried deep, the silent betrayal coded into their very blood. Fives uncovered pieces of this dark secret, crying out with clarity that no one would hear in time. And his desperate stand became the embodiment of the clones' deepest tragedy, that their greatest struggle was not with the separatists or with the war, but with the chains they did not even know they carried. Still, they fought. Still they laughed. Still they dreamed, proving that humanity is not erased by design, that dignity is not broken by manipulation, that brotherhood can bloom even in the most barren soil. And so the clone struggle became the quiet heart of the Clone Wars, unspoken by the galaxy at large, but written into the Force itself, a chorus of countless voices that whispered of loyalty, grief, and hope. Voices that would one day fall silent at a single command, but whose echo even then would never fully fade. The Jedi, once guardians of peace, found themselves reshaped by the Clone Wars into something they had never meant to be. For the order that had stood for 1,000 years as keepers of balance was thrust into the role of generals, and in that shift their identity began to fracture. They were raised to meditate, to protect, to guide, yet now they commanded legions, drew battle lines, and watched as clones, men they barely knew, died following their orders. And though they told themselves it was necessity, each life weighed heavier than the last. From the polished halls of the temple, where younglings once practiced forms in light-filled rooms, Jedi were sent to muddy trenches and burning skies, their sabers igniting not in defense, but in command of armies. And though they fought bravely, each battle pulled them further from the stillness that had defined their calling. Yoda, wisest of them all, carried sorrow like a cloak, his small frame bowed not by age, but by grief, as he watched the order he had nurtured bend under the strain. Mace Windu, unflinching in his sternness, led with clarity, but knew each victory came at the cost of their very principles. Plo Koon, compassionate even in war, tried to shield his troops with kindness, yet could not protect them from the machinery of endless campaigns. Many younger Jedi, knights not long past apprenticeship, carried scars too heavy for their years. Aayla Secura on Felucia, Kit Fisto on Mon Cala, Luminara Unduli and Barriss Offee, torn between faith in the code and despair at its compromises, each one learning too quickly that war offered no choices without cost. And always the council argued, sitting in circles to weigh strategies, their voices calm but their hearts uneasy, for though they spoke of duty to the Republic, whispers of doubt threaded their words. Were they defending peace, or had they already lost it? Palpatine, watching from his throne, deepened this unease with careful words, praising the Jedi publicly while privately sowing mistrust, feeding suspicion in senators, whispering into Anakin's ear that the Order was failing, that they could not see clearly. The war stretched the Jedi thin, scattering them across the stars, leaving the temple echoing with emptiness, and in their absence, corruption spread unchecked, further proving to many citizens that perhaps the Jedi were not saviors, but soldiers of an uncaring republic. And within themselves, the Jedi felt it too, the distance from the Force, the silence in meditation, the way visions grew clouded, the way clarity dissolved into doubt. Some still clung fiercely to their calling, refusing to surrender compassion even in battle. Others hardened, now letting the discipline of war carve away their gentleness until they resembled the very soldiers they led. In the end, their struggle was not only against droids and Sith, but against the erosion of their soul, for every order given on the battlefield was a step away from the stillness they had sworn to keep. Every victory a reminder that they were becoming something they had never wished to be. They were Jedi at war, and though they wore the title with dignity, in the quiet of their hearts many feared what that title meant, that the light they carried was dimming, flicker by flicker, until shadow crept even into the temple itself. Yet the deepest wound of the Jedi at war was not only in what the galaxy saw of them, but in what they began to see of themselves. For every campaign stripped away another layer of who they had once been, until the distinction between Guardian and General blurred into nothing more than memory. In the beginning, they told themselves the battles were temporary, a necessary burden until peace could be restored. But as the war dragged on and months became years, their robes smelled of dust and blaster smoke more than incense. Their hands grew accustomed to giving commands that condemned men to die, and even meditation could not drown out the echoes of war drums. Jedi younglings, who once learned only of philosophy and harmony, now listened to tales of campaigns from knights returning bloodied but alive. And the very culture of the temple shifted, its heart beating to rhythms it had never known. Some Jedi questioned openly if they were still serving the will of the Force, or only the will of the Senate. Some, like Barriss Offee, broke under the weight of contradiction, condemning the Order for its hypocrisy, turning her doubt into actions that shook the Council. Others silenced their doubts with loyalty, clinging harder to discipline, as though rigidity could mend the cracks forming within them. The Council itself grew weary, each member sitting taller in their chairs to hide the exhaustion creeping into their bones. And though their decisions remained calm on the surface, within them churned storms of conflict. How long could they serve both the Republic and the Force before the two diverged completely? Palpatine's shadow deepened this fracture, for every emergency power granted to him seemed another step toward tyranny. Yet the Jedi found themselves unable to refuse his demands without risking being branded traitors, and so they compromised again and again until compromise itself became their cage. They were warriors by necessity, yet every victory hollowed them, for they could feel that the Force was slipping further from their grasp, that the clarity they once relied upon was clouded beyond recognition. The Clone Wars were meant to be fought against droids and Sith, yet in truth, the Jedi were fighting themselves, fighting to hold on to the light while wearing the armor of generals, fighting to reconcile who they were with, who the galaxy needed them to be. And in that fight, they were already losing, for the shadows they had sworn to resist had already taken root within them, not through anger or hatred, but through exhaustion, through compromise, through the slow erosion of 1,000 small choices that bent them away from their calling. This was the struggle of the Jedi at war. To stand tall in armor never meant for them. To fight for peace with sabers dulled by endless campaigns. To remember their vows in a galaxy that no longer believed in them. To carry light even as it flickered, and to face each dawn with the knowledge that the more they fought to preserve the Republic, the further they drifted from the very Force they had promised to serve. And yet for all their doubts, the Jedi still fought. For to them, abandoning the Republic meant abandoning the countless innocents caught in the tide of war, and so they bore the burden, even as it bent their spirits, carrying light into places where darkness seemed absolute. On the front lines, their presence still inspired hope. Civilians fled toward the sight of glowing sabers. Children clung to their robes as if salvation itself had arrived, and though war hollowed them, they did not stop giving, even when the galaxy stopped believing. Some Jedi grew closer to their soldiers than to their own council. Bonds forged not in the halls of Coruscant, but in trenches filled with mud and fire, and in those friendships they found fragments of the humanity war sought to strip away. Others turned inward, retreating into discipline so rigid it became armor, unwilling to let themselves feel compassion too deeply lest grief consume them. But no matter how each Jedi coped, the war reshaped them all. The order that once mediated disputes and guided senators now whispered of espionage, of assassination, of preemptive strikes that sounded less like guardianship and more like desperation. They were forced to become what they had once condemned, warriors and spies in the service of survival. And though they carried the burden with dignity, inside they knew each compromise dimmed their light. To fight for peace had become to fight without peace, and the irony carved wounds deeper than any blade. Palpatine fed this slow unraveling like a master of puppets, praising the Jedi in public while quietly planting mistrust among citizens and senators, ensuring that when the end came, the galaxy would no longer see them as saviors, but as conspirators. Even within the temple, the shadow grew. Whispers that they were being used. Whispers that their actions served not the Force, but the Chancellor. Whispers that perhaps they were becoming the very thing they had sworn to resist. And so their tragedy was sealed not in one decision, but in countless ones. Each battle a thread that tied them tighter to the war. Each command a step further from their true path, until at last they were warriors more than monks, soldiers more than sages, generals more than guardians. Still they carried on. Still they lifted sabers in defense of those who could not fight. Still they stood between the galaxy and despair. Because that was who they were at their core, even if the galaxy could no longer see it. The Jedi at war were a paradox, hollowed yet unyielding, burdened yet steadfast, compromised yet still striving to serve the light. And in that paradox lay their nobility and their doom. If the Outer Rim campaigns showed the war's endless attrition, then Mandalore revealed its intimate tragedies. For here the flames did not burn only across armies, but within hearts, between loyalty and love, between peace and vengeance. And it was in these fires that Obi-Wan Kenobi found his greatest trial beyond the battlefield. Mandalore, a world of warriors who had once shaken the galaxy, stood under the leadership of Duchess Satine Kryze, who believed that her people could step beyond their blood-soaked past, who dreamed of neutrality even as the galaxy split in two, her voice soft but resolute against the storm. She and Obi-Wan had shared a bond long before the war, a love unspoken yet undeniable, forged in youth when duty forced them apart, and when the war returned him to her side, the ache of that old fracture stirred again. Satine stood as proof that not all strength was found in armies, that courage could exist in refusing war itself, but her path was fragile. Mandalore, a world of warriors who had once shaken the galaxy, stood under the leadership of Duchess Satine Kryze, who believed that her people could step beyond their blood-soaked past, who dreamed of neutrality even as the galaxy split in two, her voice soft but resolute against the storm. She and Obi-Wan had shared a bond long before the war, a love unspoken yet undeniable, forged in youth when duty forced them apart, and when the war returned him to her side, the ache of that old fracture stirred again. Satine stood as proof that not all strength was found in armies, that courage could exist in refusing war itself, but her path was fragile. His crucible. Striking down Satine's peace and seizing power in flames. Obi-Wan arrived not as a general, but as a man torn between love and duty, watching helplessly as Maul took from him what the war had already taken from so many others. In Satine's death, strangled before his eyes, the fire burned not only through Mandalore's throne room, but through Obi-Wan's heart, forcing him to carry grief in silence, to bury his love alongside his vows, to endure loss as his creed demanded. The fires of Mandalore spread beyond Satine's fall. Maul's rise fractured the Separatists and the Republic alike, his presence a wild card in Sidious's design, a reminder that hatred can never truly be controlled. Sidious himself descended upon Mandalore to remind his former apprentice of this truth, their duel cracking stone and shaking air, the master reminding the student that the web of the Sith could hold only one true Lord, and Maul, for all his fury, was cast again into chains. Yet the fire he lit did not vanish, for Mandalore burned still, its people caught between pacifism and war, its throne a prize fought over by warlords, its soil stained with the grief of one man who could never speak aloud what he had lost. The war in Mandalore's halls was smaller in scale than fleets clashing in the stars, yet it was no less devastating, for here the Clone Wars revealed their cruelest truth, that even love was not safe from the fire, that even neutrality could not withstand the storm, that even heroes who lived by duty could be broken in silence. But the fires of Mandalore did not end with Satine's death or Maul's chains, for the world itself became a crucible that burned again and again as the war dragged on, its soil too steeped in history, too fractured in spirit, to ever find peace. Death Watch splintered into factions, some loyal to Maul's iron grip, others clinging to visions of Mandalore free from outsiders, and in the chaos, the people were caught between ideologies that tore families apart. Sidious himself descended upon Mandalore to remind his former apprentice of this truth, their duel cracking stone and shaking air, the master reminding the student that the web of the Sith could hold only one true Lord, and Maul, for all his fury, was cast again into chains. Yet the fire he lit did not vanish, for Mandalore burned still, its people caught between pacifism and war, its throne a prize fought over by warlords, its soil stained with the grief of one man who could never speak aloud what he had lost. The war in Mandalore's halls was smaller in scale than fleets clashing in the stars, yet it was no less devastating, for here the Clone Wars revealed their cruelest truth, that even love was not safe from the fire, that even neutrality could not withstand the storm, that even heroes who lived by duty could be broken in silence. But the fires of Mandalore, fractures, a place where neutrality failed, where love was punished, where power was seized by the strong, but never held for long. Even Sidious, when he descended upon the world to confront his wayward apprentice, left it scarred but unresolved. His victory over Maul a reminder that the Sith's design allowed no rivalries, Yet his indifference to Mandalore itself left the planet to burn on its own. The Jedi, stretched too thin across the outer rim, could not restore peace to Mandalore. And so the conflict there festered, a wound unhealed, each flare of rebellion adding to the chorus of suffering echoing across the galaxy. The fires of Mandalore revealed what the Clone Wars truly were. Not only vast battles decided by fleets, but intimate tragedies where the choices of a few reshaped the lives of millions, where the death of one duchess could plunge an entire world into chaos, where the obsession of one fallen Sith could scar generations. And in those fires we see the war's cruelest reflection, that it was not only soldiers and generals who bore its weight, but lovers parted, sisters divided, citizens silenced, and whole cultures reduced to ashes by a conflict they never sought. The flames of Mandalore burned on through the war, licking at the edges of every story, reminding all who looked that even when the battles ended, the scars of love lost, peace betrayed, and vengeance unquenched would remain, smoldering long after the stars themselves had quieted. The Clone Wars, once a storm that seemed endless, began at last to change its rhythm, for by the later years the flames of Mandalore burned on through the war, licking at the edges of every story, reminding all who looked that even when the battles ended, the scars of love lost, peace betrayed, and vengeance unquenched would remain, smoldering long after the stars themselves had quieted. The Clone Wars, once a storm that seemed endless, began at last to change its rhythm, for by the later years the tide itself shifted, and though the galaxy did not yet know it, the end was drawing close. The Separatists, once ascendant, began to falter, their fleets shattered in more and more engagements, their droid armies losing ground not from lack of numbers, but from the resilience of Jedi and clones who refused. The flames of Mandalore burned on through the war, licking at the edges of every story, reminding all who looked that even when the battles ended, the scars of love lost, peace betrayed, and vengeance unquenched would remain, smoldering long after the stars themselves had quieted. The Clone Wars, once a storm that seemed endless, began at last to change its rhythm, for by the later years the tide itself shifted, and though the galaxy did not yet know it, the end was drawing close. The Separatists, once ascendant, began to falter, their fleets shattered in more and more engagements, their droid armies losing ground not from lack of numbers, but from the resilience of Jedi and clones who refused. The flames of Mandalore burned on through the war, licking at the edges of every story, reminding all who looked that even when the battles ended, the scars of love lost, peace betrayed, and vengeance unquenched would remain, smoldering long after the stars themselves had quieted. The Clone Wars, once a storm that seemed endless, began at last to change its rhythm, for by the later years the tide itself shifted, and though the galaxy did not yet know it, the end was drawing close. The Separatists, once ascendant, began to falter, their fleets shattered in more and more engagements, their droid armies losing ground not from lack of numbers, but from the resilience of Jedi and clones who refused. Distant from the people they served, blamed for prolonging the war, distrusted as generals who had abandoned their role as guardians. The clones, though they fought with valor, bore within them the silent command that would one day undo everything they had built. The tide had turned, yes, but it turned toward the abyss, carrying Jedi, clones, and citizens alike toward a night darker than any they had imagined. And still they fought. Still they believed that victory meant peace. Still they pressed forward with weary courage, never knowing that the tide itself was the trap, that each step closer to triumph was a step closer to betrayal, that the war's turning did not lead them home, but into the hands of the Sith who had shaped its every wave. But tides that turn do not bring only triumph. They also reveal the wreckage left behind, and as the Republic pushed the Separatists back, the cost of years of fighting began to show in every corner of the galaxy. On Coruscant, citizens no longer cheered at reports of victories, for they had heard too many before, each followed by new demands for sacrifice. Worlds taxed beyond measure groaned under the burden. Children grew up with blaster fire as their lullabies, and the Senate chamber, once a place of debate, now echoed mostly with Palpatine's voice, each decree expanding his control, each promise of peace binding the Republic tighter in his grip. The Jedi, though they marched from one campaign to another, felt unease stir more strongly, for their victories seemed to serve not the will of the Force, but the will of the Chancellor. And even as systems were reclaimed and fleets destroyed, the dark side thickened around them like smoke. Yoda felt it most clearly, the shadow pressing in with every step, yet even he could not pierce its source, while Mace Windu carried the suspicion heavily, his stern gaze resting more often on Palpatine himself, though proof remained elusive. Anakin, elevated now as a symbol of hope after countless victories, wrestled with his own growing disillusionment, torn between loyalty to the Order and trust in a Chancellor who spoke to him as no Jedi Master ever had, feeding both his pride and his fear. The war's turning tide was thus double-edged. Each triumph the Republic claimed brought them closer to winning the conflict, but also closer to the culmination of the Sith's plan, closer to the day when all that faith in the Republic's savior would become the very reason it fell. For though Dooku faltered, though Grievous ran, though Maul's gambit splintered in Mandalore's fires, Sidious had never faltered, his hand guiding every reversal, his patience ensuring that when the Separatists collapsed, it would not be peace that followed, but empire. The galaxy, weary and longing for calm, leaned toward him without knowing. The Jedi leaned away from him without proof, and the clones, loyal and silent, stood ready for the command none of them could imagine. Thus the tide turned fully, carrying them all toward an ending already written, a horizon that looked like peace, but concealed night. And though none yet saw it, the war's conclusion was not salvation, but the door through which darkness would finally step unopposed. The Clone Wars had strained the galaxy to its breaking point, but it was trust, fragile and unseen, that shattered first. For in the later years of the conflict, suspicion spread like a shadow through the halls of the Jedi Temple, the Senate, and even among the clones themselves. The cracks widened when a soldier named Fives, once a brother celebrated for his loyalty and courage, stumbled upon a secret too deep for any one man to bear. The discovery of the inhibitor chip, buried within the mind of every clone, placed there without their knowledge. Its purpose hidden behind lies of safety. His friend Tup had faltered in battle, striking down a Jedi without warning, and in the desperate search for why, Fives uncovered the truth that the war itself was built upon betrayal. He shouted warnings to his brothers, to the Council, to anyone who would listen, but the design was too vast, too carefully woven, and his words were silenced, dismissed as madness until his life was taken, leaving only questions that few dared to ask aloud. The clones mourned him as a brother. The Jedi remembered him as a soldier lost, but the Force carried the echo of his cries, a warning unheard until it was far too late. Trust between Jedi and soldiers wavered, though love still bound them. Trust between Jedi and the Senate thinned, suspicion rising that the Order sought not only to defend the Republic, but to rule it. That suspicion sharpened when Ahsoka Tano, Anakin's Padawan, was framed for an explosion in the temple itself, accused not only of negligence but of treason, her loyalty questioned by the very council she had served. The trial that followed was not only her burden, but the Order's, exposing how quickly the galaxy could turn against its protectors, how fragile the bond of faith had become between Jedi and people. Ahsoka was exonerated at last, the truth revealed. But the wound did not heal, for when the council invited her back, she refused, her heart broken by the doubt of those she had loved, her trust severed by their hesitation. Anakin watched her walk away, his own trust in the council fracturing with every step, and though his love for her remained, it deepened his resentment toward the Order that had failed her. Across the galaxy, whispers grew louder that the Jedi were no longer servants of peace but generals drunk on power, that they were conspirators who wished to hold the Republic hostage, and Palpatine, cloaked in careful sympathy, fed those whispers, strengthening doubt while praising loyalty. Thus the fall of trust became the true turning of the war, not a battle lost on the field, but faith lost in the heart. For without trust, victory could no longer mean peace, and without trust, even the bonds between Jedi, clones, and citizens could be unraveled by a single command. The fall was silent at first, but it was deeper than any wound, and though the war raged on, the galaxy's faith in the light had already begun to die. But the fracture of trust did not end with Fives' silenced cries or Ahsoka's departure. For those were only the first stones to fall in an avalanche that buried the Jedi's bond with the Republic beneath suspicion and fear. Senators who had once leaned on the Jedi for guidance now questioned their motives, whispering that perhaps the Order sought control of the war to preserve its own power. Citizens, weary of years of sieges and destruction, looked upon the Jedi as warriors no different from the separatists they fought, seeing only sabers flashing and armies marching, not the compassion that still guided many hearts. Within the temple itself, doubt grew like ivy. Younger Jedi wondered aloud if they had strayed too far from their path. Older masters feared that even if they ended the war, their place in the galaxy would be forever changed. Anakin's resentment deepened in this soil of mistrust. His faith for those were only the first stones to fall in an avalanche that buried the Jedi's bond with the Republic beneath suspicion and fear. Senators who had once leaned on the Jedi for guidance now questioned their motives, whispering that perhaps the Order sought control of the war to preserve its own power. Citizens, weary of years of sieges and destruction, looked upon the Jedi as warriors no different from the separatists they fought, seeing only sabers flashing and armies marching, not the compassion that still guided many hearts. Within the temple itself, doubt grew like ivy. Younger Jedi wondered aloud if they had strayed too far from their path, that perhaps the Republic saw them as tools to be discarded once the war was done. Thus, trust unraveled everywhere at once, in the Senate, in the temple, in the ranks of soldiers, in the heart of Anakin Skywalker himself. And through it all, Palpatine fed the unraveling, speaking softly, maneuvering carefully, ensuring that every doubt pointed not toward him, but toward the Jedi. The Council's vision, clouded by the dark side, failed to pierce the truth, and so they moved blindly, making choices that, though made with caution, appeared to others as arrogant. What was once unshakable faith in the Jedi became fragile suspicion, and suspicion, once born, can never be fully undone. The fall of trust, more than any fleet or battle, was the Republic's undoing, for it left the galaxy vulnerable not to droids or Sith blades, but to a single lie spoken at the right moment, a single accusation that would transform Guardians into traitors in the eyes of all. And when that moment came, the galaxy would not resist, because it no longer believed the Jedi were its saviors. It believed they were its threat. The end of the Clone Wars came not first in the Senate or in the chambers of the Jedi Temple, but in the firestorm of Mandalore, where the last great battle of the Republic unfolded like a tragedy written in advance. For it was here that Ahsoka Tano returned, no longer a Jedi, but still bound to her brothers in armor, and it was here that Darth Maul rose once more, his hatred burning bright enough to set a world alight. Mandalore had always been a crucible, and in its towers and under its skies, the war's contradictions reached their sharpest edge. Clones fighting to liberate a world that had never sworn allegiance to the Republic. A former Jedi leading men who still called her Commander. A Sith Lord not fighting for separatists or Republic, but for his own hunger for revenge. When Ahsoka and Rex descended with their battalions, the people of Mandalore looked upon them not as saviors, but as another wave of conquerors. Yet still the battle raged through the streets and skies, gunships streaking fire across clouds, domes cracking beneath cannon fire, Maul's loyalists clashing with clones in every alley. In the Undercity, where shadows were thick and echoes endless, but in the firestorm of Mandalore, where the last great battle of the Republic unfolded like a tragedy written in advance. For it was here that Ahsoka Tano returned, no longer a Jedi, but still bound to her brothers in armor, and it was here that Darth Maul rose once more, his hatred burning bright enough to set a world alight. Mandalore had always been a crucible, and in its towers and under its skies, the war's contradictions reached their sharpest edge. Clones fighting to liberate a world that had never sworn allegiance to the Republic. A former Jedi leading men who still called her Commander. A Sith Lord not fighting for separatists or Republic, but for his own hunger for revenge. But in the firestorm of Mandalore, where the last great battle of the Republic unfolded like a tragedy written in advance. For it was here that Ahsoka Tano returned, no longer a Jedi, but still bound to her brothers in armor, and it was here that Darth Maul rose once more, his hatred burning bright enough to set a world alight. Mandalore had always been a crucible, and in its towers and under its skies, the war's contradictions reached their sharpest edge. Clones fighting to liberate a world that had never sworn allegiance to the Republic. A former Jedi leading men who still called her Commander. A Sith Lord not fighting for separatists or Republic, but for his own hunger for revenge. Ahsoka confronted Maul, and their duel became the heart of the siege, a clash not only of blades, but of visions. Maul, fierce and broken, spoke of Sidious, of the plan that had shaped the war from the start, offering Ahsoka a chance to join him, to stop what was coming. When Ahsoka and Rex descended with their battalions, the people of Mandalore looked upon them not as saviors, but as another wave of conquerors. Yet still the battle raged. When Ahsoka and Rex descended with their battalions, the people of Mandalore looked upon them not as saviors, but as another wave of conquerors. Yet still the battle raged through the streets and skies, gunships streaking fire across clouds, domes cracking beneath cannon fire, Maul's loyalists clashing with clones in every alley. In the Undercity, where shadows were thick and echoes endless through the streets and skies, gunships streaking fire across clouds, domes cracking beneath cannon fire, Maul's loyalists clashing with clones in every alley. In the Undercity, where shadows were thick and echoes endless, Ahsoka confronted Maul, and their duel became the heart of the siege, a clash not only of blades, but of visions. Maul, fierce and broken, spoke of Sidious, of the plan that had shaped the war from the start, offering Ahsoka. Ahsoka confronted Maul, and their duel became the heart of the siege, a clash not only of blades but of visions. Maul, fierce and broken, spoke of Sidious, of the plan that had shaped the war from the start, offering Ahsoka a chance to join him to stop what was coming, had all betrayed it in turn. For the Jedi Council, the siege was already overshadowed, their focus consumed by the Chancellor's growing grip and whispers of a Sith Lord hidden among them. And so what might have been remembered as the Republic's last triumph faded quickly into silence. And for Ahsoka, the siege became a memory carved in sorrow. For though she had led with compassion, though she had triumphed without hatred, her victory could not prevent the darkness already sweeping across the galaxy. The siege of Mandalore was fire without light, a triumph already hollowed by betrayal, the final blaze before the night of Order 66 descended, a night that would make every chain, every scar, every tear shed upon Mandalore feel like only the beginning of the galaxy's grief. It came not with thunder, but with silence, not as the galaxy expected, with fleets colliding in one last decisive clash, but as a whisper spoken into 1,000 helmets at once, a command buried deep in blood and bone, waiting for years to awaken. Execute Order 66. The words were simple, almost soft, but their echo reshaped the galaxy forever. For in that instant, the brothers who had fought beside Jedi, who had bled with them, laughed with them, saved them, and been saved by them, turned as one, their loyalty stolen by an order they could not resist. Across the stars, the betrayal unfolded like a grim symphony, each note another light extinguished. On Felucia, Aayla Secura walked calmly with her men through a jungle of towering fungi, before their blasters rose as one and cut her down. On Saleucami, Stas Ali sped on her speeder through dust and shadow, before the clones flanking her fired without hesitation. On Kashyyyk, Yoda paused in meditation, his heart breaking as he felt the Force scream with the deaths of his kin, his green blade rising only to defend long enough to escape the treachery. Plo Koon, beloved by his troops, plummeted in flame from the skies of Cato Nemoidia, betrayed in a single breath. Ki-Adi-Mundi, charging forward with valor on the icy bridges of Megiddo, turned to rally his men only to find their rifles already aimed, the shots piercing not just his body, but the trust he had placed in them. Everywhere it was the same. Jedi cut down not in battle with droids or Sith, but by the soldiers they had called brothers. On Mandalore's ship, Ahsoka Tano felt the sudden shift in the Force as Rex, his hand trembling, his voice breaking, raised his blasters against her, his loyalty to her clashing with the command that burned in his mind. And through it all, Darth Sidious sat cloaked in shadows, his smile hidden but vast, for his plan had blossomed in perfection. The Jedi destroyed not Across the stars, the betrayal unfolded like a grim symphony, each note another light extinguished. On Felucia, Ayla Secura walked calmly with her men through a jungle of towering fungi, before their blasters rose as one and cut her down. On Salukami, Stas Ali sped on her speeder through dust and shadow, before the clones flanking her fired without hesitation. On Kashijik, Yoda paused in meditation, his heart breaking as he felt the Force scream with the deaths of his kin, his green blade rising only to defend long enough to escape the treachery. Plo Koon, beloved by his troops, plummeted in flame from the skies of Cato Nemoidia, betrayed in a single breath. Across the stars, the betrayal unfolded like a grim symphony, each note another light extinguished. On Felucia, Ayla Secura walked calmly with her men through a jungle of towering fungi, before their blasters rose as one and cut her down. On Salukami, Stas Ali sped on her speeder through dust and shadow, before the clones flanking her fired without hesitation. On Kashijik, Yoda paused in meditation, his heart breaking as he felt the Force scream with the deaths of his kin, his green blade rising only to defend long enough to escape the treachery. Plo Koon, beloved by his troops, plummeted in flame from the skies of Cato Nemoidia, betrayed in a single breath. Ki-Adi-Mundi, charging forward with valor on the icy bridges of Megiddo, turned to rally his men only to find their rifles already aimed, the shots piercing not just his body, but the trust he had placed in them. Everywhere it was the same. Jedi cut down not in battle with droids or Sith, but by the soldiers they had called brothers. On Mandalore's ship, Ahsoka Tano felt the sudden shift in the Force as Rex, his hand trembling, his voice breaking, raised his blasters against her, his loyalty to her clashing with the command that burned in his mind. And through it all, Darth Sidious sat cloaked in shadows, his smile hidden but vast, for his plan had blossomed in perfection. The Jedi destroyed, not Ki-Adi-Mundi, charging forward with valor on the icy bridges of Megiddo, turned to rally his men only to find their rifles already aimed, the shots piercing not just his body, but the trust he had placed in them. Everywhere it was the same. Jedi cut down not in battle with droids or Sith, but by the soldiers they had called brothers. On Mandalore's ship, Ahsoka Tano felt the sudden shift in the Force as Rex, his hand trembling, his voice breaking, raised his blasters against her, his loyalty to her clashing with the command that burned in his mind. And through it all, Darth Sidious sat cloaked in shadows, his smile hidden but vast, for his plan had blossomed in perfection. The Jedi destroyed, not filled with confusion rather than rage. For the clones themselves, though the chips stripped them of choice, fragments of memory lingered, Rex struggling to resist, others hesitating for heartbeats too long, echoes of humanity flickering beneath programming. But those flickers could not undo the order, and the galaxy awoke in a single night transformed. Jedi gone, clones rebranded as stormtroopers, citizens told that rebellion had been quenched, that order had been restored. The Force itself seemed to mourn, a great silence falling where once there had been harmony, and in that silence the Sith rose triumphant. Order 66 was not merely an execution, it was the end of an age, the extinguishing of an entire way of life, and though hidden embers of the Jedi survived, the fire that had guided the Republic for 1,000 years was reduced to smoke drifting into a night without stars. The morning after the betrayal was not filled with battle, but with applause. For as smoke still rose from the temple, and the bodies of Jedi lay unburied across 100 worlds, the Senate gathered in its grand chamber to hear the words of the man who had orchestrated it all, and with a voice that trembled with false grief yet rang with iron authority, Palpatine declared that the Jedi had betrayed the Republic, that they had conspired to overthrow democracy, that they had brought war and destruction, not as generals, but as traitors. The words were lies, but the galaxy, weary from years of endless war, believed them, because lies spoken to the exhausted often sound like truth. He promised that the Separatists were finished, that the clone wars were ended, that peace and security would at last return to the galaxy, and with thunderous approval, the Senate gave him powers beyond those of any chancellor before him. In a single day, the Republic, which had stood for 1,000 years, was dissolved not by conquest, but by consent, its senators rising from their seats to cheer as Palpatine crowned himself emperor. The war, fought in trenches and skies, ended not with a decisive battle, but with the reshaping of the very system it had been fought to preserve, and the clones who had been celebrated as defenders of freedom now marched as enforcers of tyranny, their white armor repainted into stark symbols of fear. Across the galaxy, statues were raised, banners unfurled, and citizens looked upon the new empire with relief, too tired to question what they had surrendered. The Jedi, once loved, became ghosts and enemies, their names whispered only in fear, their temples desecrated or abandoned. The council that had once guided the Republic sat in silence no longer, its circle broken, its masters scattered or slain. And in the shadows of Coruscant's towers, the Sith stood revealed at last, though none dared speak their name, for Sidious had woven his design so well that his victory appeared as salvation. Anakin Skywalker, now Darth Vader, stood at his side, not as the boy dreamed of by Qui-Gon, not as the hero loved by his men, but as a weapon clothed in darkness, his blade carrying out the last strokes of the purge with relentless fury. The galaxy did not resist, for resistance requires hope, and hope had been drowned in years of attrition, in whispers of betrayal, in the exhaustion of watching sons and daughters vanish into war. The Empire rose not on the strength of its armies, but on the weakness of a galaxy too weary to fight. And in that weakness, the Sith found permanence. Yet the Force, though wounded, did not fall silent, for even in the darkest night, embers remained. Scattered Jedi fleeing into exile, whispers of rebellion that would take years to kindle, the promise that light, though dimmed, is never destroyed. Still, in that moment, the galaxy belonged to the Empire. The Republic became memory, and the Clone Wars, which had begun with whispers on Naboo and fire on Geonosis, ended in thunderous applause that echoed across the stars as freedom was buried beneath the roar. But the rise of the Empire was not felt only in the Senate's roar or in the banners unfurled across Coruscant. It was felt in the quiet ways the galaxy changed, in the silence of temples once filled with song, in the fear that spread through marketplaces where whispers of Jedi survivors were met with caution, in the sudden stillness of systems that had once fought fiercely for independence but now bowed to the weight of Imperial fleets. The Republic's starships were repainted, but remained the same, its soldiers still clones, but their names and colors stripped away. Individuality erased until armor was uniform, faces hidden, voices blended into a single faceless authority. Where once they had been brothers, Now they were enforcers. And citizens who once cheered their arrival in times of crisis now lowered their heads as stormtroopers marched past, knowing that the age of guardianship had ended and the age of fear had begun. Jedi fugitives moved like shadows, fleeing from world to world, hiding their sabers beneath cloaks, severing ties with those they loved in order to survive. Many were hunted down, betrayed not by battle, but by neighbors desperate to protect their families, proving that the Empire did not need armies to enforce loyalty when fear itself was stronger than chains. On worlds ravaged by war, reconstruction promised by the Republic never came, for the Empire's interest was not in rebuilding, but in control. And so scarred cities remained in ruins, occupied by garrisons, their people left to hunger while the Emperor's statues rose above them. Even the Senate, though it continued to sit, became hollow, its voices drowned by decrees that no one dared challenge, its applause empty in the shadow of Palpatine's throne. The war that had begun as a struggle for freedom ended with freedom forgotten. And though some muttered of rebellion, their voices were too scattered, too afraid, too small to stir against the vast machine of the Empire. In the Jedi Temple, now silent, the great statues of wisdom stood unguarded, their gaze falling upon corridors filled with echoes of slaughter, archives sealed away as though knowledge itself had become forbidden. And through it all, Palpatine moved like a shadow crowned in light, his scarred face hidden behind the mask of protector, his empire cloaked in legitimacy, his triumph so complete that most never even saw it for what it was. The rise of the Empire was not only the fall of a republic, it was the burying of hope beneath exhaustion, the acceptance of chains disguised as order, the remaking of a galaxy too tired to remember what freedom had felt like. And so the Clone Wars, which had promised peace when won, ended instead in silence and submission, their legacy not victory but empire, their promise not hope but shadow, leaving only scattered embers that waited unseen for the day they would rise again. And still the rise of the Empire pressed deeper, reshaping not only governments and armies, but the very soul of the galaxy, for entire generations awoke beneath its banners, knowing nothing of what had come before, believing the Republic to be only a tale of disorder, the Jedi nothing more than traitors whose ambition had nearly destroyed civilization. The Emperor's voice filled the holonet, steady and commanding, a constant reminder that order had been restored, and though his words promised stability, they were woven with fear, binding citizens into compliance without the need for chains. Planets once proud of their independence now bore garrisons and governors, chosen not by vote but by decree, their cultures forced to bend to uniformity under the gaze of the Empire. The clones, once men who carried names, became ranks and designations, their individuality erased, as conscription and transition to stormtroopers loomed, their camaraderie fading into silence as they were replaced by faceless legions. The Jedi Temple, desecrated and repurposed, became a monument to the Empire's triumph, its libraries sealed, its great halls turned into a fortress where inquisitors, once Jedi themselves, now twisted into hunters, were trained to extinguish the very light they had sworn to protect. For survivors, exile was a prison of its own. Obi-Wan hiding in deserts, Yoda in swamps, others scattered to corners of the galaxy where they dared not draw a blade, their silence a wound felt across the Force. And in the hearts of the people, acceptance grew. For though the Empire's grip was iron, It offered a kind of weary relief. No more wars across every star, no more sieges stretching into years, only the cold comfort of stability. Yet beneath that quiet compliance, small sparks lingered. Senators who whispered in private chambers of the Emperor's overreach, families who remembered kindness from Jedi long gone, soldiers who still carried echoes of brotherhood in defiance of their conditioning. Those sparks were faint, scattered, and fragile, but they endured, waiting for a day when the galaxy would remember what had been lost. The rise of the Empire was not a single moment, but a tide that swept endlessly forward, covering ruins with banners, silencing voices with fear, reshaping truths into propaganda, until even the stars themselves seemed dimmer beneath its shadow. And so the Clone Wars, born in deception, ended in deception, and from their ashes the Empire stood vast and immovable, a monument not to victory, but to manipulation, a reign built not on the strength of its armies, but on the surrender of hope. The Clone Wars ended, yet their legacy did not fade with the applause of the Senate or the rise of imperial banners, for wars do not end when the guns fall silent. They linger in memory, in scars, in the quiet spaces of history where echoes never truly die. The legacy of the conflict was written in the broken Jedi who wandered into exile, carrying guilt heavy as chains. It was written in the clones who, once brothers, now marched faceless as stormtroopers, their humanity buried beneath orders and silence. It was written in the children of worlds caught between armies, who grew up knowing only the sound of blaster fire, who learned too young that peace was fragile, and trust even more so. For the galaxy at large, the Clone Wars became a story retold by the Empire as proof of its necessity, a reminder of the chaos that had nearly destroyed civilization, a warning against ever questioning the Emperor's order. In holobooks and lessons taught to the young, Jedi were cast as traitors, separatists as villains, and the Empire as the savior that had restored balance. Yet beneath that false narrative, the true legacy whispered in smaller, hidden places, in families who remembered a Jedi who had saved them, in soldiers who spoke quietly of commanders they had loved, in senators who carried guilt for the power they had granted so freely. The Force itself carried the war's memory, ripples of grief and courage woven into its currents, as if the galaxy's very soul had been altered by the scale of loss. And in those ripples, seeds of rebellion began to stir, scattered systems unwilling to bow, senators brave enough to speak, survivors who still held on to light even in hiding. The Clone Wars had been a trap designed to birth an empire, but its unintended legacy was the fire it left smoldering in the hearts of those who had seen freedom and refused to forget it. Heroes were gone, yet their names lived on in whispers. Worlds lay scarred, yet their people endured. Darkness ruled, yet light flickered stubbornly in corners it could not reach. The Clone Wars were over, but they were never truly gone, for their legacy lived on in every scar, every memory, every choice made in the shadow of their fire, a legacy that would one day rise again in defiance, proving that even the longest night cannot silence the dawn forever. Yet the legacy of the Clone Wars was not written only in the lies of Imperial propaganda or the ruins left smoldering on distant worlds, but also in the way it reshaped the very spirit of the galaxy. For every choice made within that storm cast ripples that stretched far beyond its ending. The Jedi, though hunted, lived on as myths. Some remembered them as traitors, others as martyrs. and in hushed tales told around dim fires, children grew up hearing of knights with blades of light who had once protected the weak. For the clones, their legacy was heavier still. Once heroes, they became enforcers, their names erased, their individuality crushed, until their stories existed only in the memories of those who had fought beside them. Yet even stripped of identity, echoes of brotherhood endured, whispers of Rex and Cody, of Fives and Echo, of countless others who had carved humanity into lives never meant to be human at all. For Anakin Skywalker, the war's legacy was both triumph and damnation, celebrated as a hero, remembered as the face of countless victories, yet within him the war left scars that twisted into Darth Vader, a reminder that even the greatest hope could be consumed when trust was broken. For the galaxy itself, the war's true inheritance was division, mistrust sown between people and systems, the belief that chaos was always waiting to return, and that only the Empire's iron fist could keep it at bay. But beneath that imposed fear, another legacy stirred. The war had shown ordinary beings that empires could rise and fall, that even the mighty could bleed, and from that truth came defiance. Survivors of sieges remembered how small groups of Jedi and clones had saved entire worlds, and in those memories lay the blueprint of rebellion, proof that courage could stand against overwhelming odds. Thus, even as the Emperor tightened his grip, the seeds of resistance began to grow, nurtured by the very scars he sought to bury. The Clone Wars were meant to end hope, but their legacy was more complex, for they left behind not only ashes, but embers, not only silence, but songs of remembrance, carried in secret until the day they would rise again. In this way, the war's greatest irony revealed itself. A conflict designed to end freedom forever became the spark that would one day ignite its return, proving that no plan, however perfect, can extinguish the resilience of those who still believe in the light. The Clone Wars ended, yet in truth they never slept, for their echoes carried forward through every corridor of the galaxy, whispering in the silence between stars. They were a war of armies, yes, but also of identities, of trust and betrayal, of love lost and bonds broken, of brothers who laughed together before orders turned them into executioners, of Jedi who sought peace and found only war. Their fire burned through the Republic until its ashes gave birth to an empire, and even then the flames smoldered, hidden in memories, in scars, in whispers of rebellion waiting to rise. To speak of the Clone Wars is to speak of tragedy, of victories hollowed by design, of defeats orchestrated from the beginning, of a war fought not to be won but to be endured until all sides were weary enough to surrender freedom itself. Yet it is also to speak of humanity, of clones who painted their armor in defiance of sameness, of Jedi who gave compassion even as exhaustion hollowed them, of civilians who rebuilt homes in the shadow of starships, of friendships that endured even as empires rose. The war was long, yet for those who lived it, it was a single unbroken night, a storm that refused to pass, a rhythm of blasters and sabers that never ceased until silence fell in betrayal. And even in that silence, the war did not rest, for its legacy shaped all that followed: the rise of Vader, the birth of rebellion, the spark of hope carried by Luke and Leia, the endless struggle between darkness and light. The Clone Wars became myth, lesson, warning, and memory, a story told in both fear and admiration, a reminder that even the brightest guardians can falter, that even the most loyal brothers can be turned, that even the noblest wars can hide the deepest lies. And so the Clone Wars live on, not in banners or parades, but in the Force itself, in the unseen current that remembers every voice lost, every bond betrayed, every ember of courage that refused to die. The war that never slept still lingers in dreams, in histories, in the quiet of night when the stars seem too heavy with memory, and in that lingering we are reminded that peace is fragile, freedom is precious, and hope, no matter how faint, is the one light that cannot be extinguished.